Hi everybody, this is going to be a series about the modules that make up most jazz standards. This is not going to be an exhaustive thing. I'm not going to list literally every chord progression in every tune, but these are common progressions that you may notice and should probably start to notice in commonplace jazz standards, bop tunes and things like that. Now, the value of this is partly that you can learn to hear these progressions on record. You can learn to recognize them when you see them in a chart. And also, you can use them as a basis for practicing your chordal voice leading, improvisation, and so on and so forth. So it gives you a structure to how to learn to play jazz, and it can be reflected in the repertoire of the music as well. So the first chord progression I'm going to talk about is not actually the most common in jazz, but it's often taught first, I think for a very good reason, because it lays the groundwork for understanding a lot of other stuff. And that's something we call the cycle of fourths, or cycle 4. This comes by a number of different names, but I'll just put up the cycle of fourths or the cycle of fifths, because depending which way you go around it, it's the same thing. And hopefully you can appreciate that there's a single interval between each one of these notes, and all of these notes go around, all 12 notes are reflected in the cycle. This is often used as a tool for key signatures for classical musicians, but it has much wider reaching potential as a tool. This is something that you're probably just going to have to remember, and the more you use it and the more you look out for these things, the easier it's going to be. So for what we're doing today, we're going to focus on the natural notes of C major, and for those we do have a handy mnemonic. This is going up in fifths. Father Christmas gave Dad an electric blanket. Now, this might not mean so much to Americans, but Santa doesn't work. Father Christmas is the English name for Santa. This works. If that doesn't work for you, maybe find your own mnemonic. I'm not going to do it. But now, if we play those chords, they're all going up in fifths. Father Christmas gave Dad an electric blanket. If we go around the other way, it'll probably sound a little bit more familiar. Okay, I'm starting on the 7th there. Obviously, in terms of actual chord progressions in the real world, you can sort of hop off and on whenever you like. One very good example of this is the progression to All the Things You Are. Now, if you look at the cycle, by the way, you might notice that if we are playing in fourths, like that chord progression, we're going anti-clockwise around the circle, and that's why it's called back cycling sometimes as well, because we're going backwards around the cycle. So I'm just going to play you the bass and melody for All the Things You Are, which is usually played in the key of A flat, and it starts on chord 6 of that key, so F minor. Does that, right? Now, there's an interesting property of these cycle progressions, which is that if you start with a third, that comes to the 7th of the next chord, and the third of that chord becomes the 7th of the next chord, and then so on. Third of that one, 7th of that one. Third of this one, 7th of this one. Okay, which is why they're all extended up to the 7th, right? And that's true even in classical music. This is a really good contrapuntal combination. It allows you to sort of do things like... and so on, right? There's loads of beautiful examples from the classical music literature which you can check out. This tendency to put the melody on the 3rd and 7th extends to a lot of jazz standards, so things like Autumn Leaves, for instance. 7th, 3rd, becomes 7th next chord. Or... and that's the classic cycle using... right? Moving between the 3rds and 7ths. These in jazz education, these are often referred to as guide tones. And also the butter notes, the famous butter notes referenced by Herbie Hancock and possibly Miles Davis, although nobody's quite sure if that's actually what he said. And, you know, for learning how to play through these progressions, focusing on these notes makes a lot of sense. So. It's a very good way to get the structure and sound of the chord progression by embellishing the thirds and sevenths as you go around. So definitely something to practice. Okay, I want to look at a few variations of this progression that you might see in the real world, well, at least in jazz world anyway. I'm not sure if that's the real world or not. Probably not. And probably one of the most famous examples is Autumn Leaves. In this example, we start on chord 2. I'm going to do it in C major, so that's D minor 7th, G7, C major, F major 7th. Then something interesting happens because we actually run out of notes within the diatonic cycle. The next one would be B flat. But if we stay in key, we can't have a B flat because we're in the key of C, so we have to jump. And in this case, we jump to a B. So actually that interval becomes a tritone, an augmented fourth in that case. Again, B minor 7 flat 5, then E7, which isn't normally in C major, but we're just going to raise that third up by a half step to give us a nice move into the A minor, the relative minor world. We've got an A minor 6 chord, which is also not diatonic to C major. So for that reason, I've kind of given this progression in 2 different colours. The first 4 bars are in yellow, which reflects C major. Sorry if you're a synesthete and you don't see those colours. The next 3 bars are in blue because they belong to A minor, the relative minor. Okay? But in terms of like the rules of how the chord tones work, the sort of progression of the thirds and sevenths, the guide tones, works in the same way, even though we've got that funny leap in the bass. Here's another nice example. This progression is the sort of first section of quite a few tunes. There Will Never Be Another You, which is what I've titled it after, but also Blues for Alice, Confirmation, 7 Steps to Heaven. And you can see that the movement is generally with the bass moving in fourths. We have that funny jump from F to B there. But we kind of go through 3 closely related keys. So in tonal music, the music of the 18th century and on, we don't tend to worry too much about moving from near keys to near keys. It's a very commonly done thing, whether you're moving from the sort of 1 key, the major key, to the relative minor, which we did for the Autumn Leaves example, or to a closely related major key like subdominant to dominant. Really very, very common to make these moves into nearby keys. And this example does that just by sort of tweaking a few notes in the scale as we go. So if we start in C major, we go to the F major 7th, and then we get a B minor 7 flat 5. These chords are all diatonic to C major, but you see there's a funny jump from F to B, as there was for Autumn Leaves. And then instead of playing E minor 7, we raise up the third to a half step there to G sharp, and that gives us E7. And then we do A minor 7, F sharp. And these notes all kind of belong to the A minor scales. Okay? And then we relax that B natural down to a B flat. And we move nicely into the F major there. So all we've done is moved from C major to an F major chord. I hesitate to call it modulation. I still think we're pretty much in C major, but we've just used a few little flats and sharps just to kind of nudge us from one scale into the other. And this is something that's really common throughout, tonal music, of which, but jazz is using a lot of that furniture. And, when you solo through that, it might be helpful to block it down into those 3 regions, which I've got. So the yellow region, which is the C major at the beginning, then moving into the relative minor in blue, and then moving into the subdominant 4 in green there. In terms of, again, how the guide tones work. Just for the E7 and the A minor 7, that's an interesting little thing. You get that G sharp and it moves down to a G. You could just use an A minor major 7th if you prefer to preserve that, but it does move down by a semitone, unlike the other ones. So just doing that again. Then that all happens in a very orderly way. And then like chromatic again. Sorry, F major 7th there, right? So we're having a little bit of chromatic movement in some of those chords, which is subtle, but is a little bit different from what we had for the All the Things You Are and Autumn Leaves examples. Now, if we go to the next version of that, this is all in dominance. E7, A7, D7, G7, C6. This is a rhythm bridge, but it's common in other tunes. Dozens of tunes have this progression, including Yesterdays and Relative Minor. And you can extend it up to, other degrees. Another great tune that has that is Nice Work If You Can Get It by George Gershwin. Gershwin obviously likes progression a lot. You'll see it popping up loads of places. Now, this is chromatic. It doesn't really necessarily belong to the key. The only reason why we think it belongs to C major is because that's where we arrive at the end of it. So here we're starting on E7, and these guide tones move chromatically. Both of them moving down a half step at a time and then resolving. So that makes them a little bit of a pain in the bottom to solo through if they are moving quickly. I mean, in the case of rhythm changes, each chord lasts for 2 bars. 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. And you can dress them up with 2 5s if you want. As people often do. But if you're soloing through them, each one kind of takes its own scale in a way. Another tune, which is an example of this, would be Sweet Georgia Brown. And Sweet Georgia Brown goes... Starts on chord 3 though, unlike rhythm changes, right? And then... Each these melodic phrases kind of treats each dominant chord as being its own thing, right? So when you solo on it, I'm using a... Okay, so I'm using a separate scale, if you like, on each particular dominant chords. Now, if they move very quickly, that can be a bit of a pain, so you might want to do something simpler, like an arpeggio. Or maybe just find a common tone, which sounds G. So the melody of Nice Work If You Can Get It is diatonic, despite being built around a cycle, so you can maybe experiment with those ideas as well. Like that, for instance. They are a real area of study. It's hard to do it. I mean, another way you could do it is using the so-called tetrachords, which are 1, 2, 3, 5, like this. And then that's another way you can map those changes. It's not the easiest. A particularly extensive example would be that from Jordu, which goes like this. So it goes all the way from the sharp 4, so it doesn't even stay in key. That's a particularly pronounced example. But those things can give you pause for thought sometimes. Anyway, that's the end of my whistle-stop tour of cycle progressions. This is only a small number of examples from a much wider world, so keep your eye out for these things. There's lots of them. And also the idea of the cycle is extremely useful for being able to understand other jazz chord progressions. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.